Hi, I wanted to welcome everyone to the Understanding Grief panel. We are gathered here today to talk about the intricate and often challenging aspects of grief. And one of the things we really want to bring into the realm of our discussion today is that this is a universal and normal human experience that we can come together and commune around. So this panel, as Gail mentioned, brings together a diverse group of grief professionals, each offering unique perspectives on understanding and coping with loss, which is really what grief is all about. And so I'd like to just briefly introduce our panelists, and then we will each speak for about 10-ish minutes. And after that, we're going to open up the floor for any questions, comments, and discussion. So this applies to both folks that are here in person in the audience and also online. We will be able to field online questions as well. So make sure to note anything you'd like to say or ask during that discussion time, and we will return to that. So as I said, I am Genna Reeves, and I'm a certified grief educator and local death doula. I'm also the New Mexico Community Liaison for the Heartlight Center, and I will speak more about Heartlight in just a little bit. And then we also have Dr. Adrienne Larkin with us. She is actually, she is a bereaved parent, clinical psychologist, and also co-founder of the Children's Grief Center in Albuquerque, which is now the Grief Center of New Mexico. And we also have Mickey Kivitz, who is also an esteemed member of the facilitators at the Grief Center. So with that, I'd like to hand things over to Mickey to start us off.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's not easy to talk about grief. This is a subject that has a lot of taboo and stigma and a lot of misunderstanding. I want to open this panel up today to the idea of describing what grief is, some misconceptions about it, and what is it that you can do with grief. Grief is something that came into my life in my 20s. I went to a lot of funerals of people I was close to and lost family members, lost my brother, lost people I loved, and just started my grief journey in my early 20s. Is the microphone too far away?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, that's better.
I'm going to get really awkward with this mic, so it's fun. Grief is a natural reaction to death, losing something. We feel grief anytime that we lose something, and one of the earliest misconceptions to address is the idea that grief happens in stages. If grief does happen in stages, what happens if you feel a feeling out of stage? Does that mean that you're grieving wrong? Does that mean that there's a right way to grieve? And the truth is that there's no one way to grieve. It all depends on what's right for you. Each of our lives is unique. Each of our deaths will be unique. And our individual responses to the death of people we love is going to be unique. There's no one way to grieve. I think the easiest way to conceive of grief as an idea is that grief is a wound. Wounds need to heal. And that's something that we can do. And starting today, you can start healing from whatever trauma or grief or loss that you may have experienced in your life. It's easy to think of grief as something that breaks you, which implies you need to be fixed, but I hope you know you don't need to be fixed. You need to heal. They're very different things. The misconception that grief happens in stages can be misleading and can lead to further suffering, because the idea that first you'll be in denial, then you'll feel anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. It implies that grief is going to end at some point. But in my experience, and the experience of those who I've talked with, and my experience as a bereavement facilitator, grief is not something that really goes away. Grief is something that you learn how to live with. And if it's something that keeps happening, and you feel waves of grief at different times, what is it that your body is telling you? Because grief changes our bodies. They change our minds. They change our ability to feel compassion and empathy. And when we grow as a result of grief, you'll find that you might have abilities that you didn't have before, like increased resiliency. Not to say that it's ever worth it to go through grief, because it's such a painful, hurtful experience. But closure is something that's very ephemeral and may not exist. I don't know if I'll ever truly accept that my brother died 3 days before his 22nd birthday, but that's something that I know different moments, like his death anniversary is coming up, it's going to hit me every year at that time. And some years I do better with it than others, and that's okay. There's no one way for us to grieve. So another idea to talk about is, are there different types of grief? And there's been a lot of research on what happens when somebody responds to the loss of a loved one. So I want to introduce the idea that there's 3 different ways that we connect with people in our lives. The first way that we connect is through time. The second is through space. And the third is through the attachment we have to somebody. If we connect to people through time, we can ask ourselves, how long until I see this person? And it might be 10 minutes. It might be, I'll see them next year. I'll see them at Thanksgiving. And grief will change our ability to think of our loved ones and process what it's like to miss them. If we think of space, we can think of the distance between us. And when we lose someone, we lose our time and our ability to connect with them in space, because somebody who dies is no longer here with us the way they used to be. What can be unchanged and what is important to recognize in grief is that our connection to the person can be maintained. So it's logical to understand that when a person dies, we don't see them anymore. We don't get to talk to them, hug them, love them in the same way. We love them in a different way. And that's how we honor them when an anniversary is coming up, how we might use their memory to inspire us in some way, how we might feel the pain of not having them there at an important moment. Our ability to stay connected is something that we always have a choice of doing. If you choose to stay connected, you might find that you heal at a different rate than choosing to try and push them away. Because when we choose to push away someone we love, we lose out on so much, the good feelings and the bad feelings. It's very easy to think of grief as only being bad feelings, because in a lot of ways it is. But when you have someone you love and they go away, you still have those memories that will be unchanged. You have the ability to honor them, and you have the ability to share their memories and experiences with others. So I teach a class at the Grief Center called Grief 101. There are some important tenets that I use there that we can use here in our ability to talk about grief. The first one is that coming to a symposium like this, being part of a grief community, you deserve helpful information. There's a lot of information that you can receive. You can go down so many rabbit holes in trying to find out what happens during the grief process, but know that you have a right to helpful information. So if you have questions today, we would love to hear them. We also provide options for you. We don't give advice. Advice can be a really harmful thing when it comes to your ability to cope with loss. Especially if the advice is not wanted or asked for, it can be very off-putting. But we would love to give you options in terms of, what do you want to do now that these feelings have found you? How do you want to go through the day and process waking up without that person, having meals without that person, going to sleep without that person, and then somehow finding the resolve to do it again the next day? Those can be really dark times. And I'm going to reiterate this idea that when you are grieving, you are wounded, you are not broken. The idea that you need to be fixed is very easy to wrap your head around, but emotionally it doesn't really make sense, because grief does not break you. Grief hurts you. You can heal, because all wounds can be healed from. The final idea and final tenet that I want to bring up is this concept that the insight that you all bring to these discussions is very valuable. If you choose to take a risk and share an idea or a question or a thought, you not only help yourself, you help the others who are here in this group. Grief, I believe, works best in a communal setting. When you are able to connect with people, and to the extent that you can empathize, feel compassion towards other people, you'll find that the connections that you've lost due to grief can find new connections amongst the bereaved. So here we are. We're part of one of the most inclusive, supportive clubs that you would never ask to be a part of, because the cost is just too high to be a part of this club. But once you're here, it's the most supportive group of people that you'll ever be. All right, I want to tell you some things that I have heard that I may have said in the past when I didn't realize. These are some things that happen when people don't quite know how to talk to the bereaved. And you may find a commonality in these thoughts, that when someone has not yet felt bereavement and grief, and they try and talk to us about it, They may say things that they think will help us feel better, but truly they cause harm. Things like, your brother died, he's in a better place now. I know just how you feel. It was God's will for him to die. You'll get over this in time. It's okay, he lived a full life. All of these can have a good intention, but the impact, if you've ever felt bereaved, if somebody tells you that your loved one died for a specific reason, it can shatter you inside. And if you feel triggered, know that that's your body telling you you still have room to heal, you still have the capacity to grow, but you're not there yet because somebody's words took you to a place of escalation, which happens and it's okay. There's no one way to grieve. All of the feelings you have are valid. What you do with them is your choice. It's easy to go to a place of wanting to self-harm or think, I just want this to be over with. And that's a really common feeling, and it's okay. Know that the feelings you have, the ideas you have, those are fleeting. Those are not who you are or what you are. Those are just thoughts that come into your head and leave, because all thoughts, all emotions that we have are fleeting. The grief feelings, however, can be so powerful, we may mistake them as being permanent. And know that it's okay to feel like it will never end, because I've felt that before. When somebody talks to you about grief and they're not sure, it's okay to let them know, I'm not ready to talk about it. Just knowing that someone made the attempt to reach out and you communicated with them and said, will you check back in with me later, can be a really good thing. You do have control in terms of your interactions with people, even if it feels like sometimes you don't. Because grief is going to impact you physically, mentally, spiritually, if you feel that way. It's going to change you in so many ways. And it's going to be rocky. And it's going to be like you're in a storm. I think of events like this as being part of a lighthouse, where we can act as a beacon for you to get a reference of where you are in your grief. Because grief is a journey that will last a lifetime. And every once in a while, you need a reference point to know some sort of information. Not, am I doing good enough, or am I making enough progress? Because those are thoughts that I don't have an answer for. But if you can connect with a community that allows you to be vulnerable, allows you to be open, you'll find that your ability to feel human and return to even feeling good feelings again after you've been grieving can come back. I don't know when it's going to happen or how it's going to happen, but you can recover from losing someone who made you feel the way that you want to feel now. I'm going to close out my thoughts by mentioning a few things that you can do to prepare for your own end-of-life experiences and what it's like to actually grieve for yourself. I think some of the most useful things that I've learned about my grief journey is that talking about grief is a skill, and all skills can be practiced. The more you engage in activities like what we're doing today, and the more you let your heart be open to the idea that you're not going to have all the answers, but you're willing to work towards it each day, you're going to make progress. You're going to feel good some days talking about grief, which might sound counterintuitive, but like, for an example, I feel so good talking with you all because I have so many feelings that I can't express out in the world, but I can express them here, and it makes me feel useful, it's meaningful, I feel connection. When grief finds you, you have the choice to think about, what am I going to do now that these feelings have come? You can try and lock yourself away and do unhealthy things and cope in unhealthy ways. I've done those things. It didn't make things better. But that was part of my journey to go through, just like it's going to be part of your journey to experiment and think about what is going to be something that I can do to put my feelings somewhere. Like when we have good feelings, we might dance or listen to music or draw or cook or do anything with good feelings, because our society is set up for expressing good feelings. We're not as well equipped for talking about things that make us feel terrible, because who wants to share something that makes them feel terrible? There's this idea that you can transfer ideas and feelings in a negative way. And I hope that something you learn from this panel is that talking about bad feelings doesn't mean that you're bad or that someone's going to feel bad. Talking about bad feelings can be a way of connection that you might not have explored yet.
So I wanted to continue our chat about grief with just a little bit of context about my background with this and where I am coming from. So I wanted to just say a little bit about myself. I started processing loss and grief at a very young age. I experienced my first death when I was in elementary school, and there were many that followed. And death was something that I became familiar with from a very, very young age. In the early 2000s, I continued engaging with this topic. And I was born and raised in Los Alamos, New Mexico. So this festival is very near and dear to my heart as a native New Mexican. And I was one of the founders of the Los Alamos, New Mexico chapter of the Yellow Ribbon Suicide Prevention and Awareness Group. I later served as their president in response to the suicide death of a friend in high school. And I also wrote a curriculum for suicide prevention support groups that was used in Los Alamos. I've also been a social sciences university professor in another part of my career earlier on. And I've been a faculty member at Oregon State and Kansas State and did research about how fashion, clothing, and textiles can be used to memorialize individuals and historical events and how people learn from that memorialization. And so I shifted in my career to train to become a death doula through the International End of Life Doula Association. And I also serve as the co-chair of the Global Wellness Institute's Dying Well initiative. So I have a hand in lots of things related to death, dying, and grief. And what I can tell you that I have learned personally and professionally to sum everything up really compactly is that grief really does need to be witnessed. We should do it in community, and we should be okay with talking about it. And that's one of the things that's really helpful about conferences and festivals like this, is that we do have a platform to be able to do this and to create a sense of community and less stigma around it. And so Mickey began to touch on the types of grief that we can experience. And I wanted to expand on that a little bit in terms of types of loss and specific circumstances that can arise before and after a death when it comes to grief. So the first type is one that's important to the theme of this festival, and that's anticipatory grief. A lot of folks don't know it's really common and normal for grief to start before a loved one has passed or before you've actually lost something. And this type of grief really allows you to prepare for an impending loss and foster a meaningful connection before a loss occurs. Really what anticipatory grief means is that you are having feelings of loss for a life that you currently lead or up until recently led, and you see loss happening around you in various ways. It might be through death, it might be through other means, and you know that more is coming down the line. And so there's sort of a sense of dread around what else might be to come, and how do I prepare for that? That is one of the things that can be important about understanding grief when it comes to having end-of-life conversations, because a lot of folks report that when they have these conversations about what you want at the end of life and for your death and funeral, then it can give rise to natural conversations around grief and how you want to remember one another. And that can be really powerful and impactful. Another type of grief that I wanted to mention is secondary grief. And this occurs when we experience other losses that result from a primary loss. We may call these losses secondary, but it's really important to say that they can feel just as big as the primary loss. So let's say that you experience the death of a loved one. Some of the things that might involve a secondary loss would be loss of income, loss of your faith, if you have an existential crisis around the death, loss of identity, confidence, friends. Those are just some of the examples. And so the way that I often talk to folks about this is, how do we think about secondary loss in terms of how you can visualize it, and that is like a domino effect. So you start with a death, and then all the dominoes can start to fall when it comes to figuring out what comes next and what will the consequences or fallout or next steps be in the process. Another type I wanted to briefly mention is collective grief. And this occurs when a group, and this could be defined in lots of ways, culture, society, community, family units, however you define it, this is how a group processes loss together. Collective grief in a family can be very complex and an emotional experience. It involves a lot of shared feelings, but it also involves individual processing. And so there's a multi-layered approach that happens when grief occurs in a collective sense. And it's relevant to understanding relational dynamics at the end of life because the emotions surrounding the end of life can become so complicated. The other thing I want to mention to bring this back to our current events is that this type of grief is especially relevant with the events currently going on in our world, including the Israel crisis. So one of the things that I've heard from a lot of people is that they've been feeling extra tired since these events started happening in the world, or they might be feeling more irritable towards their family and friends. This is not a coincidence. There are many ways that grief can impact our ability to function. And Adrienne is actually going to speak more about the impact of grief on physical and mental well-being. So we'll dive into that a little bit more, but just one way to bring it back to what we're currently dealing with in our world. So the next thing I want to talk about are the types of support that you can get for grief. And there are a variety of types that you can seek out, and I wanted to talk about some different options. The important thing that I like to remember, and this really speaks to one of the things that Mickey was highlighting, is that each griever knows their own life and their own grief best. And so it can be really helpful to trial and error any of the options that are available for grief support and see what works best for you. The first option that you can go with for support is your immediate circle. So this might be your, what you might refer to as a built-in support system. Family, friends, church members, community members. It could be a variety of folks. But do keep in mind that one person may not be able to be your total source of support. So that is where we come to some other options. The second is online grief communities, and reading about and interacting with others online who have experienced a loss can be very helpful, particularly because it's convenient and it might have a bit more of an anonymous quality to it. The thing that I like to warn people about when it comes to online grief communities is that you want to make sure that you're doing research to ensure that it is monitored and facilitated in a way that might be helpful for you, because unsupportive comments, it can feel demotivating or like a step back in your grief. And so just kind of do your research about what those groups are about. The third option for support is peer support groups. And peer support groups are important on a variety of levels. First of all, sharing and listening to others can be a really powerful experience, and it brings a sense of healing and connection. So they can be an open support group format where there's no set curriculum and different participants can join at different times. And anyone can add or drop the group at different times. There's also what we call a closed group format, and this is a group with a defined beginning and end. So let's say 4 weeks, for example, with the same participants each time. And everybody does different support group formats differently, so it can be helpful to just decide what you might want to try first. The thing to remember about peer support groups is that they're not a replacement or a substitute for therapy. It can be therapeutic in nature, but it is not clinical therapy. The fourth is individual clinical therapy with a formally licensed counselor or therapist. And then lastly, you can also seek individual grief peer support. So this means that you're working with someone who has been trained as a grief peer support and has also been through the grief process themselves at least one time, and can create a brave space to explore what you're going through with your grief. This could be talking about feelings, it could be doing artistic or creative activities, and really it's meant to help you learn how to live a meaningful life again with a sense of support in terms of trying to foster hope. The inclusion of the term peer support, again, just to highlight, indicates that the individual is not a licensed therapist, and it is not a replacement for clinical mental health therapy. As Mickey highlighted, grief is a skill that can be practiced, and one of the ways that we do this is by using support resources that are available to us. And we are fortunate to have some truly wonderful resources to tell you about in New Mexico and virtually. We are very lucky here in Albuquerque and broader New Mexico to have the Grief Center. And Adrienne is going to speak in detail about the Grief Center and her unique journey with that location and that special place that we have here. I wanted to provide some information about a new local resource that we're fortunate to have, which is the Heartlight Center, for which I mentioned I'm the New Mexico Community Liaison. Heartlight Center is a nonprofit that's based in Denver, Colorado, that companions and educates people through their grief to find hope by offering virtual and local support groups, workshops, seminars, and resources. And so we release calendars multiple times a year in 3-month increments so that participants can plan ahead for different events. We do offer a variety of grief support options, and the thing to remember about Heartlight is that it's group-based. And so we do like to offer a variety of support groups in terms of how the topics get divided out for the gatherings. And this can include ongoing support groups, certain types of losses. So for example, we have groups around loss to suicide, loss of a spouse, etc. Our loss of a spouse group actually meets here at Daniels, Wyoming once a month, where we are at today. And we also have structured curriculum-based support groups as well. We do offer virtual programs, and so you can connect from anywhere via Zoom. So for those of you that are on the Zoom call today and maybe looking for grief support resources, there are options that do not require you to be in person. And so definitely seek those out because they can be a good asset. One of the things that's unique to Heartlight is a curriculum-based program that the founder of Heartlight wrote and created called Facing the Mourning. And it's an interactive support group designed to help with the grieving process by using visual tools to process grief. And so it happens over 4 to 5 sessions, and the participants share their stories, build memorials, compose letters, and write in journals. And by the end, the goal is to develop milestones for goals for what you want to do with your grief processing. And it's designed for all types of losses. And so it's open to anyone. And that's the only program that we have that has a defined cost. Otherwise, most things are donation-based and free of charge, and no one will be turned away. Another unique aspect is that Heartlight's mission, very similar to the Grief Center, includes supporting professionals and volunteers that work with those who are grieving. And so we offer workshops and professional development presentations several times a year so that people in the community, both professionals and the general public alike, will feel supported in how they are working through grief, whether they are themselves or helping others. One of the things that this festival does is promote healthier conversation around end of life and by extension grief. And so one of the things I wanted to highlight are things that you can do to keep the conversation going with resources. You can refer those you know to grief resources. If you hear folks in your circles struggling with grief, let them know about what's available in the community, because sometimes it's hard to pull that information together, especially when you're in grief. Another thing you can do is if you work for an agency or any type of office, you can put grief information or resources in your patient packets or client packets. You can also post resources around town, wherever you live or at your place of business or community centers, to get the word out about resources. And you can also inform grief professionals like myself, like Mickey, and like Adrienne, about the needs that you have observed in our community around grief and how we can best support each other around that. We have all brought resources to share with you, so there's lots of flyers out in the lobby. And for those of you on Zoom, if there's anything that you would specifically like, feel free to get in touch with any one of us, and we would be happy to provide that for you. The one thing I did want to highlight really quickly is a few unique benefits of the local resources available. We do collaborate together. So Heartlight and the Grief Center do collaborate in ways that allow opportunity for continuous wraparound support throughout the month. And so basically what that means is if there's a support group that meets once a month, and that doesn't feel like enough for you, there might be another support group that you could attend through another resource, or through, maybe it's for a different specific type of loss that can help provide that. The other thing I wanted to highlight is that the Grief Center in Albuquerque does serve children, so those 18 and under, and Heartlight focuses on adult-based support for those 18 plus. And so those are some important distinctions to keep in mind when you're referring folks to grief support. Support groups are a type of support, as we mentioned, and the other thing that you can do is individual grief support. This is something that I do through my private practice, Invictus by Genna, Grief and Loss Services. And again, just keep in mind that these are not licensed therapists, but there are trained professionals. And so in my case, I went through training with David Kessler, who is a renowned grief expert, and became a certified grief educator with him. So that's something that I do on an individual and group basis. I did want to, as I close out my time today, highlight some benefits of grief support, because as we were all talking and preparing for this panel, we thought it was important to let folks know what it's like to be part of a grief community. And there are numerous benefits, and we know that it can be scary to enter these spaces. Heartlight does publish an online letter series called Heart to Heart, where other grievers can write a letter to just a general grieving population and feel a sense of connection around it. So I wanted to read you a passage from a letter that was submitted earlier this year, and it's by a gentleman who lost his wife 1 year prior and was writing about how he got through the first year. One thing that I learned fairly early on is that I could run, but could not hide from my grief. Initially, I ran as hard and as fast as I could, trying to be busy, probably drinking a little too much and not acknowledging what I was going through. I soon realized that avoidance was not helping. In fact, it probably made things worse in the long run. So I eventually made the decision to face up to my grief and handle it as best I could. I have attended support groups at Heartlight and my church. For me, the benefit has been sharing my story out loud, even to strangers, and listening to their stories. While we are all unique and our grief is unique, some common emotions that run through all that I and we have shared.
I am going to talk about physiological and psychological reactions to grief. We, on this panel, we feel like we have the best presentation because we're actually talking about feelings. And if grief does anything, it brings up feelings. And there's a lot involved in grief. There's this whole conference is informing us, but we feel like we have the best part. We're going to talk about real people and how you feel and what happens. So grief is a full body experience. Not just emotional, it's not just psychological, it's also physical. It takes a toll. When a person has been informed, especially suddenly, of the death of a loved one, the initial reaction is a flood of stress hormones. Cortisol, adrenaline, it takes over the body. It affects the whole nervous system. You know that often when people hear that a loved one has died, they actually fall down, fall to their knees, not even able to stand. The body itself goes into shock. Blood pressure is affected, heart rate is affected. The body experiences severe fatigue, sometimes paralysis. Sometimes the person feels like they can't even move, and someone has to pick them up and carry them in that immediate grief reaction. Sleep is disordered. And of course, you know, if you don't sleep well, you don't do anything well. Your body doesn't do well. There are various aspects to sleep. Some people have nightmares, and sleep is disrupted. Some people, for example, in many cases, if you've been informed or someone that you love has died and you go to sleep, you don't want to wake up, because waking up is that new awareness. It's like feeling the trauma every day when you wake up. It's because you have some relief while you're sleeping. And then as soon as you wake up, your thoughts start to go to, oh, wait a minute, this is not a good day. I am not happy. It is not okay. This terrible thing happened to me. For children, often they fear sleep. They don't want to go to sleep because sleeping looks a lot like dying. And particularly if someone died in their sleep, children can become afraid to fall asleep. A longer term effect, physical effect, is lowered immunity. Stress affects immunity. People then get sick more, are more prone to illnesses, more vulnerable to illnesses. And this was especially true during COVID. There were grieving people suffered, and grieving people seemed to get sicker. I had a good friend who was grieving, who got COVID and died, a relatively young person. It's a full body experience. There's also something, in extreme cases, a person can get an intense rush of hormones that cause chest pain and an incredible sense of despair. Feels like a heart attack. And this has actually been recognized now as broken heart syndrome, also called Takotsubo syndrome, cardiomyopathy. And I think this is progress, that this has been recognized by Western medicine, by medical doctors and facilities. The Mayo Clinic has addressed this broken heart syndrome. It's usually temporary, but if there are complications with other illnesses, other kinds of complications, it can result in death. And you've probably heard of stories where someone in a traumatic situation was not really physically assaulted, but they have what seems like a heart attack because of the stress. Another thing that I think is progress is the Mayo Clinic actually not only defines this syndrome, but they recommend that the solution for it is not medication, not any kind of medical treatment. They actually admit that the best thing for this syndrome is social support group. So it's not just the medical model. We're getting away from that a little bit. They recognize that being around other people who are bereaved is helpful. So let's talk about some psychological effects.
and a lot of these are obvious. Grief is, again, overwhelming to the senses. That that same flood of hormones affects people's psyche. The initial, if you think about initially being told, hearing of the death of a loved one, the immediate reaction is no, no, that didn't happen, that can't have happened, that's not acceptable, no. And you see that dramatized when people act these roles. They say no and fall to their knees. It's a kind of a denial. There are many desperate attempts, things that people do when they're feeling that trauma and that intense feeling that it can't be true and it has to be denied. One thing that people do is to externalize it. And I did this somewhat myself. When I realized after my son died, in several days when I would go to sleep and then wake up to the horror that had actually happened, I remember actually saying, it didn't happen to me, it happened to someone else. I literally picked my worst enemy and I said, and in my mind, it had happened to them. And I actually thought, oh, that's too bad it happened to them. I'm glad it didn't happen to me. Your mind goes to extraordinary lengths to deny that this has happened to you. Another thing that people do to get away from that painful knowledge is to dissociate. You think, oh no, I'm not going to be in this body. I don't like this body. This is too painful. I'm not staying here. I'm getting out. And you hear about this with trauma too. People who are traumatized dissociate. You have to get yourself out of that situation. It's too painful. And I remember leaving the hospital. We had 24 hours in the trauma unit, not knowing if our son was going to recover or not. And when we finally left the hospital and were getting into the car, I wasn't there. I wasn't in my body. I can still see it. I was above the hospital and I was watching these three people walk to their car, but I wasn't there. I couldn't handle it. In these situations, reality always wins out. You can't really stay dissociated or stay externalizing the trauma. You get reminded over and over that this really did happen to you. So that as a defense mechanism is not effective. It doesn't work in the long run. So in talking about children, hopefully we're a long way from those days when people said, oh, he was just a child when his mother died or brother died, and so they won't remember it, or they're too young to have any reactions. But I heard those statements not that long ago. Children don't, oh, they're resilient. They don't suffer. They'll be fine. Well, you know, the truth is it's harder on the children than it is on the adults. Children are in their formative years, and that means they're forming their opinion about people, about stability, about the world. And their world is not a safe place. It's not predictable. It's not okay. And their sense of security and control and predictability is shattered. Children also, because they're of their developmental stage, engage in some egocentric thinking. They think, oh, it must have been my fault, because at that stage, at those developmental stages, everything is about them. The world circles around them. So some children fall into a situation where they think, well, I was mad at mommy and now she's dead, so it was my fault. Or I hated my brother sometimes. I wished he would die, and then he did die. And which is frightening and terrifying and very disorienting for kids. And they can live with that guilt. It can remain. Obviously, depression and anxiety are common. They can become personality traits if they persist. There is such a thing as a depressive personality that tends to see what's wrong, focus on what's unpredictable, what's not safe, what's not secure. And that can develop into a personality style. And the same with anxiety. Children can get so upset and nervous and anxious about anything bad that happens that they become anxious as a lifestyle and are constantly hypervigilant and looking for what might go wrong and wanting to do anything they can to prevent it. Some children start refusing to go to school because if they leave home, somebody else might die. So in their mind, they have to stick around to see what's going on and make sure everybody else is okay, make sure nobody else dies. So a lot of school refusal has nothing to do with school. It's about staying home and taking care of people. Another thing that can happen to young people when they experience a death is that they have a sort of a psychological failure to thrive. They give up. They think there's no point. You know, everybody's going to die. I'm going to die. I may die early too. What's the point? My brother didn't get to grow up and get married or go to college or have a family, so I shouldn't do that either. And that's a very sad result. Another really sad result is for the young person who says, well, I'm not going to get close to anybody again. I'm not going to love anybody. I'm not going to have a partner because they could die, and I'm not going there again. I'm not doing that. So some people actually have a relationship avoidance and keep people at a distance for their whole life. It looks like we're running out of time a little bit. No, we are, aren't we? So I want to, should I just move on to the Grief Center?
Sure.
And okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something just about, there are two things. One is diagnosis, and that's very controversial when people talk about diagnosing grief or diagnosing people with depression. And one of the things about being around a lot of grieving parents is that I've heard so many stories, and the whole range. People would say, I went to a doctor and they told me I was depressed and they wanted to give me antidepressants. And I was so furious. I said, I am not depressed, I am grieving. Don't do that. Don't diagnose me with depression. And I understand that point of view. But there were also other people who said, yeah, I went to my doctor and he told me I was depressed. And I said, well, congratulations, of course I'm depressed. You know, how long did you have to go to school to figure that out? Yes, I'm depressed. You can write it down there. You can give me an antidepressant. You know, I need it. I can't go on like this. I can't do this. So and the same thing with medication, whether a doctor is recommending medication. Some people say, do not tell me I need a medication. I'm not sick. And other people said that antidepressant saved my life. So I like to fall on the side of not judging, and it's all okay. It's all whatever that person needs. I also want to mention, just for any people who are in the field, DSM-5 has included a grief disorder now. We've never had one before. And it's very controversial. But I want to say, to their credit, they state that grief is the natural response to the loss of a loved one. And they really are only diagnosing in cases where people want to use their insurance, have therapy, or – yeah, just that, yeah, it allows insurance to be used. But I'll talk a little bit about grief support. I started out when I was a bereaved parent going to the Compassionate Friends, which is a fabulous grief support group. It is just for parents who lost a child, but it's a grief support model that is so healing. I say it saved my life. There was a point at which I didn't want to talk to anybody. I didn't want to talk to a therapist. I didn't want to talk to my friends. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I only wanted to talk to another mother who had lost a child because I didn't see a path forward. I thought, no, you just can't survive this. And then I thought, well, there are mothers over there that all survived it. And those are the only people I wanted to talk to. That also gave me a model of how to start a grief center. There were no grief services for children when my son died, which was in 1995. And we used to take our surviving son to Compassionate Friends workshops where they would have a sibling group, but they only had those out of state. So we were going out of state to try to find a support group. Luckily, in the later 90s, there were several people who started talking about we need a grief center for children. And I was right on board. I was right there. And so we used that grief support model that is extremely effective. It took us a few years to get off the ground. We started around the kitchen table. But now we run 36 support groups a week. We work with children as young as 3. There's no upper age limit. We run support groups for children of all ages and adults at this point. We also have services for.
Well, if there are any questions that anyone has about anything, feel free to reach out to Gail for contact information, or you can contact Heart Lake Center or the Grief Center, and we'll be happy to help you. So thank you for being here.